If you have invested $50,000 into Palantir just 2 years ago, your $50,000 today would worth around $800,000, making you almost a millionaire. But instead of investing in Palantir, you decided to buy that brand new car. And if I ask you how much does it worth today, I bet that it already lost at least a third of its value. But looking back and regretting your decisions makes no sense. It's better to look far into the future and find out more opportunities. And what I'm about to share with you in this video is one of the greatest opportunities that's about to come. And you have a chance to take advantage out of it because we're about to witness one of the greatest wealth transformation in history. So make sure to give this video a thumbs up and let's dive in. To understand what's happening with the US economy, we have to go slightly back in history and understand how the US taxation system works. Back during World War II, when Japan attacked the United States at Pearl Harbor, the United States had to raise taxes in order to fund the war. It raised income tax from less than 30% up to 94%. So the people who made over $400,000 suddenly started paying most of their income, and I'm talking about 94% of their income into taxes. Imagine you are making $100,000 and out of the $100,000, you are going to pay $94,000 in taxes, and you will keep in your pockets just $4,000. So the motivation to work harder to make more money significantly went down. So no one was actually motivated to work hard. No one was motivated to make more money. When the war was over, taxes weren't reduced dramatically. They were only reduced to 70%, which is of course much better than 94%. But if you know that you are going to pay 70% of your income into taxes, would you actually work extra hours? Would you actually work harder? Probably not. And taxes were pretty much high for the entire history after World War II, especially when the United States was having a Cold War with the Soviet Union. Back during those days, the world was a completely different place. On one side, we had the United States. On the other side, we had the Soviet Union. And both of these countries were trying to outspend each other militarily to build the most advanced weapons and win the Cold War. So when Ronald Reagan became the president of the United States, he had a completely different approach compared to his predecessors. He wanted to win the Cold War. But because it came from the private sector, he understood that people in the private sector have no motivation to work hard when they're paying so much in taxes, when they're paying up to 70% of their income, which is why he proposed a completely different idea and reshaped the entire structure of the US economy. Instead of taxing people at 70%, why don't we reduce taxes to around 30%? People will work more, the economy is going to grow faster, which will bring more money into the government's pockets. So less taxes is going to lead to more spending. More spending is going to lead those corporations to make more money, which will allow them to invest more into the United States, grow the economy bigger, grow spending, and when people spend more taxes is going to come to the pockets of the government. So while we're actually lowering the taxes, we're increasing the revenue. So he passed the Economic Recovery Act of 1981 and reduced taxes from 70% to 28%. That was a massive shift in the economic structure of the United States. Imagine you're paying like 70% in taxes for the highest earners. Of course, the United States has a progressive tax system. You're not paying 70% on everything. It's like on the first 10,000, you pay a certain amount of taxes. On the next 20,000, you pay a certain amount of taxes. But anything made above $400,000 was taxed at 70%. So nor the corporations nor the employees were actually excited about making more than $400,000. But now, because they reduced the tax rate to 28%, suddenly I was like, I want to make more money. I want the company to pay me more. So I will work harder. I will innovate more. I will work overtime. The economy started growing tremendously and more money started flowing into the government's pockets. He also reduced the corporate tax from 46% to 34%. That's not massive, but considering to those days, it was actually really high. And if you're wondering why the corporate tax rate was much lower compared to income tax, you have to ask yourself a question. Who is providing all of these jobs in the country? It's the corporations. So if you keep it above 50%, there won't be entrepreneurs building businesses to provide those those jobs. He also reduced capital gain taxes from 28% to 20%. If I'm buying stocks and then I'm selling them next year and I made a profit of $100, I have to pay 20% in taxes. Prior to that, it was 28%. Now we have lowered that number and we are incentivizing people to put most of their spendings or savings into the stock market, to use their savings to invest in the US economy. So lowering taxes actually have a really great impact on the economy. Yes, percentage-wise, you're collecting less taxes, but now you're collecting a lesser percentage of taxes out of the bigger economy, which might even result in a bigger revenue. The economy did actually grow. When Reagan took office, the GDP was less than $3 trillion. By the time he left the office, it was around $6 trillion. Doubling the size of the economy in 2 presidential terms is one of the unique things that has ever happened in the history of the United States. But if you adjust those numbers to inflation, then the real GDP actually grew by 32%. When you have high inflation, the economy anyways grows bigger. It's not the real size of the economy, it's just the prices are actually growing faster. So on paper, the economy might have doubled, but that doesn't mean that the real economy has doubled. What's more interesting is spending. First of all, revenue decreased dramatically in the beginning because he suddenly cut taxes. And when you're cutting taxes, the impact of that is going to be felt immediately. If you used to collect taxes on 70%, people suddenly won't be making much more than that. If you, for example, used to work and used to make like $100,000, you won't be making $200,000 tomorrow. Yes, you might be making that money after 2, 3, 5 years. So the implications on the government's revenue is not going to be instant. It is going to take years, but you still need money in order to spend and keep the government functioning. On the other side, he increased military spending by 40% during his presidency because he was so eager to win the Cold War. The implications of his decisions led to catastrophic results. Deficit instantly jumped from $74 billion up to $221 billion. If you compare those numbers to today, it might not be a lot. But remember, we are talking about 1980s. The dollar was much more valuable. Since then, we had massive inflation where the dollar lost over 90% of its value. So if we adjust these numbers to today, we are talking about real trillions of dollars, which is why the government had to rely on debt. The debt grew from $1 trillion to $2.6 trillion. When suddenly not much money is coming into the government's pocket, you have to get that money from somewhere. In the short run, we are going to borrow money in order to close the deficit. But as more people start making more money, we are going to borrow less money and rely on these new sources of the revenue that is going to come. It all sounds really great in theory, but you have to understand one simple fact about the government. The government is really great at spending and cutting taxes, but it's really bad at raising revenue. So the outcome was very obvious. There was a turning point when the national debt started growing tremendously. Like up until Reagan's presidency, it was very moderate. Yes, it was high to a certain extent, but it was nothing compared to what we have today. And it wasn't growing because every president of the United States that came out, he actually kept the budget very balanced. He knew these are the sources of the income and this is on what we are spending this money. But when Ronald Reagan changed the entire economics and lowered taxes from 70% up to 28%, it had catastrophic impact on the budget. And you had to borrow money from somewhere in order to pay Social Security, to pay Medicare and other government expenses, such as expanding the military spending to the point where you want to win the Cold War. You have to get the money from somewhere. The money doesn't simply get out of the skies. You have to work hard for it. And if you're not collecting that money from tax revenues, then you're borrowing it from somewhere. And that's why the national debt skyrocketed from around $1 trillion to $2.6 trillion. Now, these are the numbers adjusted to inflation. Something between $3 trillion to almost $9 trillion, almost tripling the national debt. When Ronald Reagan realized that it was a catastrophic mistake to lower down taxes so dramatically in such a short period of time, it was too late already. So if there is one person to blame for the catastrophic increase in national debt of the United States, it's Ronald Reagan. But it was too late already. the damage was already done. Trillions of dollars have shifted from the entire economy and flowed into the top 1%. The rich got richer, the poor got poorer, and the inequality grew dramatically. Even though that he started increasing taxes, as you can see that back at the end of his presidency, it didn't help. Ronald Reagan single-handedly changed the entire course of the US economy, and that was one of the greatest opportunities somebody could take. There was one of the biggest wealth shifts in the history of the United States. And what President Trump is doing today is pretty similar to the Reaganomics. When Trump became the president for the first time back in 2017, the first thing he did is that he cut taxes. When you meet a girl whom you want to actually impress, you try to brag about how much you make. So even though that you're making like $100,000, you might over-exaggerate slightly in order to give her a good first impression so that she starts thinking that you're a successful, great guy with whom she should start dating. But when a government tells you how much you're making, you are trying to underestimate your income, because the less money you make, the less taxes you're going to pay. And that's why there is something called income and a taxable income. These are completely two different things. So you might be making a lot of money on one side, but when a government comes and you can reduce your taxable income, you will pay less in taxes. So you might have a multi-trillion-dollar corporation that makes like hundreds of billions of dollars in revenue. But if you look at their final profit, it's zero. So how much taxes do they pay? Exactly 0% in taxes. Because in reality, they're not making any money. But their CEOs are flying private. They have hired hundreds of thousands of people, and they're one of the largest companies in the world. Let me give you an example of how Trump cut taxes for everybody. Prior to Trump, for the income between $38,000 to $93,000, the tax rate was 25%. After Trump tax cuts, it was lowered down to 22%. For the highest earners who used to make $426,000, the tax rate was like 40%. But Trump did not just lower the tax rate to 37%, but he increased that number to $500,000 and more. The same thing applies to married couples who are actually filing together. But here's where the interesting part starts. He actually doubled standard deductions for the single filers from $6,500 to $12,000. For married couples who are filing together, from $13,000 to $24,000. Remember the example I gave you with the girl you're trying to impress and the government? So if you have made $100,000, can you tell the government that you actually did not make $100,000? You actually made much less than that. So under Trump, you can actually reduce your taxable income by at least $12,000. So if you have made $100,000, your taxable income is going to be $88,000. First of all, you're paying taxes on a lesser amount, even though that you took home $100,000. And secondly, you will be falling under a smaller tax bracket than you had back in the past. He pledged during his campaign that he will get rid of the SALT $10,000 cap. You have federal taxes that you pay to Washington, D.C., and you have the state tax that you're paying to the state you're living. So some states have income tax, other states do not have, such as Florida. Suppose you are making $300,000 and you live in California. And California is one of the states that has one of the highest state taxes in the country. And you would pay $24,000 at least in state taxes. Under the current system, you can deduct $10,000 out of this amount and further lower down your taxable income. But under the new system, you can claim the entire $24,000 as a tax deduction and further lower down your tax rate. Trump's tax cuts did not leave corporations alone. Just like Ronald Reagan back in the days reduced tax rates to 38%, in fact, you know what? They have been around 30% for a very long time until Trump became president and he lowered down to 21%. So lowering down to 21% the tax rate is one of the lowest tax rates in the entire history of the United States. Last time the US had such a low tax rate for the corporations was way before World War II. We are talking about the Great Depression back in 1930s. And right now he has pledged that when he is going to renew the tax rate, he will lower down the tax rate to 15% for the corporations who manufacture their products in the US. Now, the main question is that did Trump's actions lead to the exact same consequences as Ronald Reagan's actions? What did Trump's tax plan actually work or not? Let's take a look at the numbers and figure out. When Trump became the president back in 2016 and passed his tax cuts, the deficit was negative $584 billion. So the deficit was already almost $500 billion. To give you some context, it wasn't Trump's fault because Trump became president in 2017 and the US government was already having a huge deficit since 2001. It has never balanced the books. First of all, there was multiple wars that the United States should not have started, and then the 2008 financial crisis happened that forced the government to borrow trillions of dollars to save the banks and the economy. Trump's philosophy was very similar to Reagan. In the beginning, there is going to be a huge increase in public deficit. So it has grown from $500 billion to $1 trillion by 2019, just before the pandemic. On one side, when Reagan actually was the president, he increased military spending in order to win the Cold War against the Soviets. But when Trump was president, there was a completely different crisis. The COVID-19 happened and the government had to borrow trillions of dollars in order to save the economy. Right now, the government is in trouble because it's making $5 trillion, but it's spending $7 trillion. And cutting spending is not easy. However, Trump has a plan. He does not simply want to cut taxes. He had to create other sources of revenue in order for the government to pay its bills, which is why he's introducing external sources of revenue by imposing higher tariffs on foreign goods and services. A tariff is simply a tax that you put on foreign goods. If I want to bring something from China and sell it to the United States and the price $100, the government is going to charge me, let's say, a 60% tariff. So the final price in the United States is going to be $160. And that extra $60 is going to go to the pockets of the government. At least that's the idea in theory. On one side, it is going to increase prices. On the other side, it is going to increase the revenue of the government. So in theory, instead of taxing people, why don't we simply tax foreign corporations? But you have to understand that if you are actually taking such measures, foreign companies and foreign countries will retaliate by taking the exact same measures against the United States, and that could hurt the US economy, and it probably won't go as fast as it was planned initially. However, the main question is that how much can realistically the US government raise from tariffs? I took the highest numbers, and that is $700 billion. That seems like a lot of money, but it's nothing compared to the $2 trillion deficit that the government is running right now. You also have to consider the fact that Trump also wants to further lower down taxes to 15% for corporations and introduce new deductions in order for you to reduce your taxable income. So the $700 billion will most likely simply offset the losses that the government is already making. The government is really great at cutting taxes, it's really great at spending money, but it's really bad at cutting spending. Trump has actually a completely different strategy by introducing DOGE. We want to eliminate all government agencies where money is being wasted. We want to restructure the entire military. So instead of spending $1 trillion on the military, why don't we spend like $300 billion? Instead of spending $1.5 trillion on Social Security, let's find out where that money is actually going, and we might be able to lower down Social Security payments and literally cut spending to like $5 trillion. Is that a possibility? Well, I don't know. It seems very unrealistic, and if you look at all the estimates by the experts, that's not going to happen. So if Trump is going to cut taxes like he's doing right now, and he won't be able to cut spending, when Trump is actually out of the office, the national debt might grow dramatically. Right now, the national debt to GDP ratio is 100%, and by the time Trump is out, it might be 150%. And most of that money is going to come out of debt, which means that the economy is going to be inflated, which means that the stock market is going to rise dramatically, because the first thing that happens within the economy when you're borrowing so much money, asset prices start rising. And when we talk about assets, we are talking about real estate mostly and the stock market, because the stock market represents the entire economy. So by the time Trump is out, the stock market might be actually booming. Yes, the national debt will increase. Yes, the government might actually run through a huge deficit. But on the other side, there will be a great wealth transformation, because when the dollar is going to become less valuable and asset become more valuable, the top 5% or the top 10% will get much richer. And that's why if you look at the numbers, the top 10% of Americans literally own more than 90% of the entire stock market. So if you want to take advantage out of this great wealth transformation that's about to happen in the next couple of years, then make sure that you start investing and understand how the market works. That's it for today, guys. Thanks for watching and see you in the next one.